This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 124 of Here's How for the 13th of September 2021. In this podcast, an in-depth investigation into academic standards and media gullibility in Ireland.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Here's what we've got coming up for you in this podcast.
No, I'm not going to talk to you, really. I don't think you're the right kind of person.
Excuse me?
I don't really, I'm not going to do a podcast with you. I'm just saying that.
So that's coming up shortly. But first, I want to thank all of our donors on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who does that. If you don't know, Patreon is basically a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month. And that helps us to do podcasts like this one. Just to put it in context, we've been working on researching this particular podcast for more than a year. So if you can support that work like the other donors do, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. And joining me at the microphone on this podcast is the co-producer, Kevin Wolf.
Hello, William. So what are we talking about today?
Sex. We're talking about sex, or to be specific, we're talking about academic standards in higher education, particularly with a unit called the Active Consent Unit, which is based in NUI in Galway. They seem to be quite closely connected with the university and with the Students' Union there. And they've issued 2 reports on sex and young people, and I've been going through them, and as I see it, there are a number of problems with these reports. I'm going to talk about 2 figures in particular in these reports. And I'm conscious that it's not a good idea to give out a load of numbers on a podcast. People find that hard to absorb in an audio format. So I'm just going to talk about 2 specific numbers, although there are a lot of other problems with the reports. The numbers are one very high number and one very low number. The high number is for the percent of students in Ireland who have been raped during their time in college. It's 29%. You can see that's an incredibly high number, a very, very serious issue. And the low number is 4.5%. That's the proportion of women who've been raped who report that rape to the Gardaí. The 2 numbers were published by the Active Consent Unit, as I said. They got a huge amount of publicity, and I think that there are serious question marks over those numbers, and I'm going to talk also about academic standards in the Active Consent Unit reports.
Okay, so sex and academic standards. So let's give listeners what they want and talk about the academic standards. So what standards are at issue here?
Well, I'm sure you know, you're in academia as well, Kevin, that university research, academic research is normally peer reviewed. And that basically means it gets published in a journal, an academic journal, which is basically a magazine for nerds. But the gatekeeping on that is that it has to be checked out by other experts in whatever topic is being published, and they independently check it. They check the calculations, they check the logic and so forth. And it's only if they agree that it's worth publishing does it get into the academic journals. But even if it doesn't get into the academic journal, or even if it's not even submitted for peer review, academic work is meant to meet certain standards. So, for example, you're supposed to publish all of your work. If you do 10 experiments and 9 of them tend to refute the conclusion that you're looking for and 1 of them supports it, it's obviously not ethical to publish the one that you like and hide the others. And you're supposed to really publish all information that could impact your conclusions, and you're supposed to not misrepresent the results. And also one important thing is you have to be open about any possible conflict of interests. If you are standing to make money or even just esteem out of one particular experimental result compared to another, you should at a minimum declare that in your work. And universities, including UCG, or NUIG I should call it, they all have research ethics offices which normally check what a researcher proposes to do before they do the research, and often then after it's done, they check that it meets the ethical standards of the university.
Okay, and so your contention is that the active consent unit has not fulfilled these standards. How can you expand on that?
As I said, sex is a really good way to get a headline in the media, and sex and young people, that has a mixture of salaciousness and moral panic that really is likely to attract headlines. And it's notable that on the Active Consent Unit website, they're offering a service of providing what they call workshops, which are aimed at second and third level students to teach various things, including consent in the sexual context and a range of other sex education courses. And from her website, it seems that one of the members of the unit, Dr. Caroline West, she's also offering similar workshops privately. And it's pretty obvious that the target market here is teachers and university administrators who would get these guys in to talk to their students. Now, the websites don't say what they charge for this. I've asked them and they've refused to answer, but I presume that they're not working for free. And this, straight out of the gate, is a clear conflict of interest. It's not declared in the reports, but obviously, if they're talking up the moral panic in the media, that can only serve to increase the demand for the service that they're offering. And if they're saying that 29% of female students in your college are being raped, here's what you can do about it. Hire us to come in and run a workshop to teach students to behave better.
Okay, and is that what the report is saying, that 29% of students have been, or female students have been raped?
Well, it's what they say that it says. Those are the figures that they put on their social media. I'll put up screenshots of their Twitter feed that says that on the webpage for this podcast. And here's an excerpt from a video that they posted on their YouTube channel.
Active Consent's 2020 Sexual Experiences Survey shows that a high percentage of our third-level students experience sexual violence and harassment during their time in higher education.
We asked over 6,000 students from 14 higher education institutions about their experiences of sexual violence and harassment during their time in college. 29% of females, 10% of males, and 28% of non-binary students reported non-consensual penetration by incapacitation, force, or threat of force.
Okay, so you say, they say that that's what the report said. But so what does the report actually say?
Well, those figures are in the report, but the narration in the video is definitely not true, according to the report that they actually put on their website. In the video, it says that they asked 6,000 students. That's just incorrect. Clearly, it says in the report that actually they asked 183,000 students to take part in an online survey. They cooperated with USI, the Union of Students in Ireland, to send out an email asking them to complete this online survey. More than 12,000 people clicked on the link to take part in that survey. And of that 12,000, most of them gave up. And that's not terribly surprising because the survey took half an hour to complete. And, personally, I don't have patience to wait for a 30 seconds YouTube ad to be over. So a 30-minute survey, it's not surprising that people would abandon that. And only about 6,000 students completed it in their terms, although they defined completing it as getting to the 80% mark. So it's pretty liberal use of the word complete. But in any case, that 29% of females and 10% of males, that's of the smallest cohort of the 6,000 people who nearly completed the online survey. That's who they're saying reported being raped.
Okay, so and just for clarity, the clip said the expression we used was non-consensual penetration. Is that legal or academic jargon for rape?
Yes, non-consensual sexual penetration. That's literally the legal definition of rape. So I actually think this is something that the researchers got correct. Really correct, because sometimes when you're researching some of these very sensitive topics, somebody who's been a victim, particularly if they've been a victim of violence, they're not going to be comfortable with the label of being a victim. So it is a clever thing to do to ask them about the individual elements rather than to accept that label. And that's a fairly widespread strategy when you're asking people about sensitive things in academics. So I agree with them. I think they should have done that, but they amount to exactly the same thing. But one thing that they definitely didn't get correct is saying that this self-selecting cohort, that the features of that the results from this self-selecting cohort apply to the wider population. Now, you and I will be familiar with opinion polls. Most people who listen to this podcast will be familiar with opinion polls, and you'll hear the words, this was, a representative sample. And if you answer an opinion poll, the first thing that they'll ask you is your income, where do you live, how old you are, and a whole load of other demographic questions. And they're using that to make sure that they have a balanced view of the country. And even at that, opinion polls can be wrong, but they're usually a few points wrong. But with this, with an online survey where the people who complete the survey are completely self-selecting, that really has no validity at all. And I found an example of this from about a year ago when there was the Trump-Biden debate in the US-American presidential election. The Journal, Irish news website, they did one of their little surveys on the day before the poll. They said, are you going to stay up late to watch this debate between Trump and Biden? And more than 25% of the people clicked, yes, I'll stay up and do it. This is something that was on the RT News channel between 2 and 3 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, just for reference. Now, if you apply that number to the whole Irish population, 25% of the Irish population is nearly 1.3 million people. And if that was true, that would mean that the Trump-Biden debate on the RT News channel between 2 and 3 o'clock on a Wednesday morning was one of the most watched TV programmes of the entire year. To put it in context, the All-Ireland Senior Football Final had 800,000 viewers, which would have been 500,000 less viewers. And I talked to an advertising source about this, and he was withering about this particular possibility. He said that normally at that time of the morning, the RT News channel would be lucky to get viewership in the hundreds, but for something special like this, you might get a few thousand, maybe 10,000 if you were very lucky. So that's way less than 1%. So what's happening there? And of course, what's happening is that the people filling in, clicking on that survey in the Journal, they're a self-selecting group. They're automatically people who are interested in politics news because they're reading about American politics on the Journal. They're particularly interested in the presidential election. So it's the people who are more likely to be watching it anyway. And of course, there's the effect of they give the answer that they think they should give and say, oh, yes, of course, I'll stay up and watch that. Likelihood is they fell asleep far before it started.
So sorry, you'd mentioned a conflict of interest earlier that was undeclared. And you've mentioned this issue with the methods. Did the Active Consent Unit acknowledge this methodological limitation?
Very, very slightly. Most of the report is very highly designed. It's a big, colourful document, 66 pages long, lots of colourful graphs, tables and so forth. Then right at the end of the 66 pages, there's a couple of pages of dense text. And within that, there are 2 paragraphs under the heading Self-Selection of Participants. And basically it says, some students affected by sexual misconduct or harassment may have felt particularly motivated to voice their experience through the survey. It's also plausible that some students with negative experiences would have found participation too distressing. So they're kind of both sidesing it there. They're saying on the one hand, on the other hand. They don't come to any conclusion, though. And they just seem to just presume that they've hit lucky and got a representative sample.
Okay, so they're maybe playing down how much of an effect this might have, even if they do acknowledge it. Mm-hmm. So is there kind of anything else that is kind of unacknowledged or not disclosed about the report that people should know about?
That's one issue, the self-selecting issue. Another issue is how the questions are asked. And pollsters have long known that the way you ask a question can have a huge influence on the answers that you get. And if you've ever had a sales call, you'll know that salespeople are trained to ask a whole load of questions. Oh, did you have a good weekend? Oh, the weather's terrible, isn't it? They're trained to ask questions that get you saying yes quite often, because then when you come to say, will you buy the product? You've been almost trained to say yes. And good opinion pollsters, they are very, very careful not to prime the respondent and not to push them towards one response or another. And bad opinion pollsters, well, let me just give this example from Yes Prime Minister from about 40 years ago.
This nice young lady comes up to you. Obviously you want to create a good impression. You don't want to look a fool, do you? No. So she starts asking you some questions. Mr. Woolley, are you worried about the number of young people without jobs?
Yes.
Are you worried about the rise in crime among teenagers?
Yes.
Do you think there's a lack of discipline in our comprehensive schools?
Yes.
Do you think young people welcome some authority and leadership in their lives?
Yes.
Do you think they respond to a challenge?
Yes.
Would you be in favour of reintroducing national service?
Yes. Oh, well, I suppose I might.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course you would, Bernard. After all you've told you can't say no to that. So, alternatively, the young lady can get the opposite result.
How?
Mr. Woolley, are you worried about the danger of war?
Yes.
Are you worried about the growth of armaments?
Yes.
Do you think there's a danger in giving young people guns and teaching them how to kill?
Yes.
Do you think it's wrong to force people to take up arms against their will?
Yes.
Would you oppose the reintroduction of national service?
Yes.
Okay, so you're saying that maybe the survey had some questions, like the questions in the clip we just listened to, that may lead someone to a particular answer?
Yes, they might have, but we don't know. Because, and here's the next serious ethical breach. The active consent unit are refusing to release the questionnaire in the survey. So this is obviously this is a substantial thing. It took people half an hour to complete. The wording of that will be very important, and even the layout of that will be very important. And as we'll hear later, this is an ethical breach. Not only should they release it when they are asked for it, they should actually be publishing it up front as an appendix to their report. And for some reason, they're not doing that.
Okay. But I do think it's important to maybe raise one question. You know, you've mentioned the figures, the headline figures, the 29%, which, and I hasten to add that any number above the number 0 for this particular topic is too high. But your intuition says that this, you know, these figures they seem too high. Is it possible that, you know, that kind of intuition is deceptive? Like, I recall the Me Too campaign, for example, that was essentially designed to demonstrate how widespread issues similar or identical to this one are. Are you maybe being a little bit pedantic about here, kind of, you know, fixating about a bit of sloppiness in disclosing conflict of interest when the real story is that the figures are so high?
Yeah, that's a really reasonable question to ask. First of all, you're absolutely right. Any number above 0 is too high. But academic integrity, I think, is really important here. And in at least one case, we can externally verify that the figures in this report are wrong, and they are wildly wrong. If we take the two figures that I start out with, we only want to mention those two figures, otherwise people get confused. There's the 29% of women who supposedly were raped during their time in college, and there's the 4.5% who reported to Gardaí. But if you just multiply those two together, you get a group of 1.3% of females, and actually also 0.3% of males, who, according to the report, say that they have reported being raped to the Gardaí. And we know that that number cannot possibly apply to the wider student body, because there's about 250,000 students in Ireland. They're less than 5% of the population. But using those percentages, if those percentages were true, that would mean that just students alone, less than 5% of the population, would constitute more than double the number of reported rapes that actually do happen in a year. So we know from the CSO, they get Garda numbers, that generally about 1,000 or maybe a bit less rapes are reported to Gardaí in a year. If those percentages that the active consent unit are publishing truly applied to just to students, then students alone would make up more than 2,000 reports of rape to Gardaí. So that's obviously impossible.
Okay, we're getting kind of issues beyond the research itself a little bit here. But and suppose I think maybe it should be fair to ask, whether you're kind of judging this research by the wrong standards. I mean, was it ever supposed to meet academic standards?
Yes. We set up an interview with the Active Consent Unit. They put up a speaker, a woman called Dr. Caroline West, and I got to ask her specifically if the report was intended to meet academic standards.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everything is done, above the board. Everything's very transparent. We're linked in with the Department of Education. We try and follow, the guidelines that are set out in their national consent framework. So there's a long history there of us conducting research in this particular field.
Okay, are there any other issues you might have with the figures?
Well, as I say, we don't have any of the background information. For whatever reason, the Active Consent Unit are refusing to publish any of that, like the questionnaires or anything. And one that I'm concerned about, I want to be clear that I don't know definitively what the case is, but one that I'm concerned about is the definition of rape that they're using. And the reason I bring this up is because, of course, there is a very specific definition of rape in law, but this is a very highly contested area in the ideological sense. And for example, there's one prominent feminist, Robin Morgan. She's a very, very influential writer in radical feminism. And I just want to read one thing that she said when she was defining rape. She says, rape exists any time sexual intercourse occurs when it has not been initiated by the woman out of her own genuine affection and desire. Anything short of that is, in a radical feminist definition, rape. Because the pressure is there, it's in his body language, his threat of sulking. How many millions of times have women had sex, quotes, willingly with men they didn't want to have sex with? How many times have women wished just to sleep instead or read or watch The Late Show? It must be clear that, under this definition, most of the decently married bedrooms across America are settings for nightly rape. So, obviously, I wanted to clarify exactly what their definition was with Caroline. And she said, and kind of a very hip down with the kids acronym they have, OMFG, which they say stands for ongoing, mutual and freely given. And the interview ended badly, but I did try to clarify this point with her. A neat little acronym there, OMFG. So ongoing, very clear. Mutual, very clear. That last one, freely given, is open to a wide number of interpretations. And I just want to analyse that with you, and maybe even to take it in context of the Robin Morgan quote. So she's saying, if a woman offers sex because she fears her husband or boyfriend or whatever will be in a bad mood if she doesn't, does that constitute rape?
Okay, so we just have to be very clear about the law as well. So rape in Irish law is particularly defined as penetration, whereas sexual assault, there doesn't have to be necessarily penetration. There can be other forms of sexual activity. So there are some activities that are legally rape and some that are legally not rape. So I think that's kind of, important to kind of make that distinction. It's also important, I think, to recognise Robin Morgan is quite extreme, I think.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
And wouldn't generally represent, mainstream feminism or a large population, perhaps, as well. But if you are feeling like, if I don't do this, then there will be consequences for me, then that's not freely given because you're acting out of fear or survival in that stage.
Let's analyse that. Consequences. It is entirely possible that there are people out there who feel that if they don't have sex with their partner, they will be broken up with. That might not be something that was ever said by the partner. That might be a conclusion that was arrived independently by the other person. And it might not even be correct. So you can see that there's an awful lot of wiggle room in that freely given. And that, to me, when you say that, it's not entirely clear where the line is being drawn.
I think, those factors around fear are pretty straightforward. And there's a really great new book.
But fear of what?
Fear of consequences or violence or extensive harm.
Okay, violence, very clear. Okay, violence to me is very clear. If somebody is for a bona fide reason, fearing I'm going to get beaten up or be in some other way the victim of violence if I don't have sex with this person. That's very clear, and I don't think anybody listening would dispute that that is rape. But if it's fear I will be broken up with.
But that's not what I'm particularly talking about here. I was talking about violence in the term of domestic violence, things like coercive control, where there doesn't have to be physical violence, but that is still violence. Violence is...
So you can hear there, I was trying to pin her down on exactly what the meaning of fear of consequences was. I don't think that she was really clear on that point. Everything we do in life has consequences. So if you don't specify what sort of consequences, then that's wide open to interpretation.
Okay, so there's a bit of a sliding definition or an issue with clarity about the definition. But you said, I just want to come back to something you said there before you played the clip. You said that the interview ended badly. So what happened there?
I tried to press Caroline on the fact that there are different ideologically driven definitions of rape and to pin her down on where they stood. And as you can hear, she didn't want to be pressed on the topic. Does that issue arise? Do you get either genuine or maybe manufactured sense of grievance from some males on that topic?
I think this is, again, it's outside my remit here and stuff as well. So I think what may be best is if I terminate the interview and I can refer you on to Pádraig and Siobhan, our programme leads. And if they want to talk to you on that particular level, they absolutely can. I'll forward your email address onto them. But I think this is outside the particular role that I was informed about the interview for.
Okay, I think that's very unfortunate because, I mean, there's a lot of issues here and I can stick, if you feel that's better, entirely within the work of the active consent unit. But I would have thought those are issues that would arise. But if you want, I can stick entirely within the work of the unit.
I think at the moment, I think just given on how the interview has gone, I would like to terminate it, and I'll refer you on to Pádraig and Siobhan, and they'll ask those bigger questions. I'm just here to talk specifically about my brief that I have been given by my management. I'm not here in a personal capacity and not here to have that bigger conversation, which I do appreciate absolutely needs to be talked about. It's just outside my remit of this particular interview and the particular remit that I have today.
And you're not willing to answer questions specifically about the active consent unit's work?
I'm absolutely going to refer you on to Pádraig and Siobhan, and they can take that from there.
Okay. Well, listen, have a good day, Caroline.
I also just don't give my consent for this interview to be released.
Okay, that doesn't have any validity, but I'll note that.
Okay, well, I definitely want to come back to something about this, something being mentioned about the definitions and this topic being ideological and therefore difficult. But, I think it's very important then just straight away to ask, from my own peace of mind, Caroline just ended the interview there. She said, I don't give my consent for this. You sounded very confident when you said that doesn't apply or that's not valid. What do you mean by that?
I mean, essentially what I said. Nobody has the right to dictate what a broadcaster or a podcaster can or can't use. I'm sure Donald Trump would have liked to say that he didn't consent to people playing the tape of him boasting about grabbing women's genitals, but that's just not something that anybody's entitled to do.
And we've had you've had guests, terminate interviews before, and I know that I'm sure they're well within their rights to do that at any time. But Dr. West said that she would refer you to someone else. Did that happen?
She mentioned there that she'd refer me to Pádraig and Siobhan. That seems to be a reference to Dr. Pádraig McNeela and Dr. Siobhan O'Higgins. They're the two lead members of the Active Consent Unit, according to the NUIG website. I emailed both of them multiple times to ask them to come on the podcast. They didn't reply. I also sent them a list of written questions. They didn't reply to that either. And I sent a list of questions to the NUIG press office. I did get an acknowledgement of that email, but again, no reply. But I did also get Dr. Siobhan O'Higgins' phone number. So I called her, and this is what happened.
Hello?
Hello, is that Siobhan?
Yes.
Hello, Siobhan. This is William Campbell from the Here's How.ie podcast. I sent you an email yesterday.
No, I'm not going to talk to you, really. I don't think you're the right kind of person.
Excuse me?
I don't really, I'm not going to do a podcast with you. I'm just saying that, okay?
You said I'm not the right kind of person. What did you mean by that?
Oh, I just, yeah.
Excuse me?
Okay, so they obviously, they're not going to talk to us anymore. I think that's clear.
Mm-hmm.
But in the past, was the coverage of this report being, like you mentioned, it was well publicised?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that they got a huge amount of media coverage, and that basically 100% of it was favourable. They were covered by News Talk, by the Irish Times, by the Examiner, the Independent. They're broadsheets. They do cover academic research sometimes, but they were also covered by the Herald, the Mirror, the Sun, the Journal.ie, and even the Irish Post. And there wasn't a hint of criticism of the methodology in any of those media reports. And I think that it's worth noting this question that was put by the RTE interviewer when it was covered on Morning Ireland.
There was a similar study done about 7 years ago. I know they're not directly comparable, but the scale of reported sexual violence in that study was much lower. Does that mean that there has been a huge increase since, or that the awareness of consent means that people are more likely to either report or to categorise what happened to them as being sexual assaults?
I think it's notable there that when the interviewer noted that the figures in this report were not consistent with previous research, he offered two possible explanations. One possible explanation was that there's a big rise in the incidence of rape, and the other possible explanation was that there's a big rise in the reporting rate of rape. And they don't even contemplate the possibility that the figures here might just be wrong.
Okay, I think you touched on this briefly earlier, but, you know, are there other studies that you would compare to results with that suggest that the figures are wrong?
Yeah, just this week, actually, the Rape Crisis Centre published figures that said that 36% of rape cases that they dealt with were reported to the Gardaí. Obviously, that's not strictly comparable. But 10 seconds on Google got me two studies. One was a general population study, which suggested that 31% of rapes are reported to the police. That was published by the US Department of Justice. Another study, also from the Department of Justice, and this time specifically of female college students, so it's really relevant here, and it found that 20% of the victims of rape made a report to police. Now, those figures are low, but they're nowhere near as low as the 4.5% reporting rate that is claimed in the active consent units study. So all these other studies, they're going from 20% to 36%. In that context, it's just really difficult to understand how the active consent unit are getting a rate of 4.5% and have that valid.
Okay, and do you think that the issue of defining rape, that impacts other areas of the study?
It could. Again, as I say, we don't have sight of the questionnaire. We don't have an understanding of how they defined it. And there's one term in the report that I find concerning in terms of definition, just because it's vague, and that's incapacitation. And what they mean by this is people who have either drink or drugs taken. But of course, how much is an important thing. Now, you know, force and threat of force are pretty clear. Nobody could misunderstand those factors in a rape. But the alcohol one, and I think it's mostly alcohol we're talking about here, you know, there is a question as to how much alcohol constitutes an inability to give consent. And there's a hint of this in another area of the report, because of the people who did not report being raped to the Gardaí, which is the overwhelming majority of the people who say that they were raped according to the report, they break down the reasons for why the person didn't report to Gardaí. And pretty much the top reason is, and this is quoting verbatim how they do it, they say, thought it was not serious enough, not a crime. 54% of the respondents said that. That's a huge amount. In addition to that, 14% said they didn't report to Gardaí because they didn't want the relationship to end. And 38% didn't report to Gardaí because they wanted to handle the matter themselves. Obviously here, by the way, the respondents were allowed to give more than one answer. That's why they total to more than 100%. But it's worth comparing those answers and the figures for those answers for a different type of answer. And for example, people who said they had been raped in the study and didn't report it to Gardaí because they didn't want to be involved with the Gardaí or the courts, 20%. Because they thought they wouldn't be believed, 14%. And because they didn't think the Gardaí could do anything, 10%. Those last reasons there, they strike me as much more typical of someone who knows she's been raped and, for good reasons or bad, is making a decision not to make a criminal report. And it's notable that those other answers are far more common. The ones, somebody saying supposedly has been raped, but thinks that that's not serious enough to bother reporting it to the Gardaí. Those type of answers are coming at a much higher rate than the other answers that I think are typical of someone who doesn't have faith in the system to look after them. That's, to me, very strange. And I have to say that looking at those, the first thing, if I got hold of the background data on this, that would be the first thing I'd be looking at. How exactly were they defining that?
So you interviewed someone else in academic ethics then, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. Dr. David Ellis is a senior lecturer at Bath University. I purposely went outside Ireland to get somebody on this. He's on the Academic Ethics and Integrity Committee at Bath University. And I started by asking him if his job was to make sure that academic ethical standards are maintained.
Yeah, that's right. So, we advise on lots of different issues around academic ethical issues in terms of development and implementation. Yeah, that's right.
And you said that it's standard for universities to have an ethics committee who would look into how research might be done before it's done and before it's signed off on. And just to run by you some of the issues that we're discussing in this podcast, in particular, if somebody who's doing the research has potentially the possibility to benefit financially from one outcome of the research over and above another, how would you normally handle that?
So normally, in an ideal world, that should be declared at the outset as part of any research design. And ethics is there to protect participants and the researchers. Mm-hmm. And that's something that an ethics board would expect to see on an ethics application, is to say, I'm doing this, but, I have shares in X company, or I have, some sort of financial interest that might affect what happens. And an ethics board might come back and say, well, here's some ideas of how you could avoid this issue going forward, for example.
And when it then comes to publishing data, tell me about the responsibilities, for example, to highlight when you're publishing data, whether it is generalizable, whether it's a representative sample of a particular population or a self-selecting sample.
So generally, in terms of researchers, it's about making sure that when findings are published, that's made clear in a write-up or when information's been disseminated to the public, is that, this is a sample and it may not be representative of everybody. And the responsibility of the researcher is just to be open and transparent with that. One of the best ways of doing that is to also just make the data freely available, as obviously in an anonymized form, mm-hmm. so that other researchers can also scrutinize the analysis or the decisions that were made by the researchers.
We're dealing here with research that is, I think, in an area that's prone to false reporting, that people might be understating, in other cases maybe overstating their own sexual experiences. Is it important then to also publish how the questionnaires were done, for example, the text or the layout, so that people can critique that?
Oh, absolutely. And that should happen at the ethics stage regardless. But in terms of what this would often be referred to as open materials as well as open data. Mm-hmm. So, the cornerstone of science is that we can replicate what people are doing and develop it and build on it. So it's pretty important that, other people can say, oh, this is the questions that were asked. It's not meant to be there to trip people up. No research is perfect, mm-hmm. But it's there so that people can see, oh, this is what happened, this is what was done, and they can either build on it. From a sort of, funding point of view, it's often taxpayers' money that funds a lot of this work. So, it's kind of, if it's there, it can have much more value going down the line. So I mean, that's good for researchers as well.
You will be familiar, maybe not all the listeners are, with the concept of peer-reviewed work. This is research work that is published in independent, very high standard journals who, before anything is published, get other independent researchers to check it. When you see a university putting up reports that are not peer-reviewed, what does that signal to you?
Well, it's not impossible. It does happen, and there's various bits and pieces of research that are commissioned that universities are involved with that won't go through peer review because of whatever the nature of the work was, or it has a specific purpose, and that's fair enough. But more often than not, most of the research that universities are involved with, or academics and researchers are involved with, goes through peer review, and that's where you write up your findings, they go to a journal, and in an ideal world, you get some expert views from people in the area who ultimately, with an editor, make a decision of, are we going to publish this or not?
And when research topics and research reports hit the news and get very wide coverage, particularly on perhaps tabloid press, and there appears to be an inaccuracy, and I think often what happens here is that journalists are overstating what the report might be saying. If the researchers are taking part in that, do they have a responsibility to say, no, what we're saying is this? Because I'm looking at a situation here whereby reports from tabloid newspapers that are absolutely not information that's in the original report are being highlighted on their website.
So, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, as somebody who also has done work with media a lot in terms of their own research, I mean, it's tremendously important that as a scientist, you think very carefully about what you've got in your kind of academic write-up, but then how you translate that into a press release, which is often what the media sources will pick up on first. They might come and ask you more questions, but they might just take the press release. And it's working very closely with press officers at universities and other colleagues to make sure that you're saying something in a press release that obviously conveys what the results are and why it's interesting, but also being very mindful of how this could potentially be taken out of context, or an incorrect spin could be applied to it. Now, researchers cannot stop that from happening completely sometimes, but I think when you're dealing with topics that are sensitive or potentially could change public policy, or could alarm members of the public, you have to be really, really careful.
Dr. David Ellis, Associate Professor of Information Systems and member of the Academic Ethics and Integrity Committee at Bath University, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
It's pretty clear that there are some differences between what Dr. Ellis there says is good practice and what you're alleging about the report. But I want to talk about the fact I said I wanted to come back to the idea that there are ideological issues at play. And I want to give the researchers the benefit of the doubt for why they don't want to talk to you anymore. I mean, is it possible that going through this research with a fine-tooth comb and asking these questions that you are perceived by them, or are in fact kind of positioning yourself as against awareness of this issue and educating people about sex, and maybe that's why you got the reaction you got when you called it the second time?
And there's no doubt this is definitely an ideological minefield, this area. There are very strong views. I personally find it really shocking that of all the media coverage that this got, which is a lot, as far as I can see, we're the only outlet to actually question the content of the report. I think that might be because, questioning the report might be seen as politically incorrect. But having said that, even if the figures are total garbage, and I suspect that they are, and the other research in this area is actually what's correct, this is still a serious problem. And we covered this a few years ago on the podcast. We talked to a group called Men's Voices Ireland, and I think I challenged them very robustly indeed when they were minimising rape figures. And I mentioned how some sections of society can just dismiss this issue. And I brought up the case of the rapist Danny Foley of Mean in Listowel in County Kerry, and he had a queue of men, including the local parish priest, to shake his hand after he was convicted of brutally raping a woman in the town. More recently, there was a case of a Cork barrister who told the jury in a rape trial that the underwear a woman was wearing indicated that she must have consented to sex. And, these are really very important issues. I think that shows that there's a long way to go in Irish society on this issue. But I get the feeling that whether they're doing it consciously or not, the researchers in the active consent unit might be trying to egg up the issue as a way of expressing that importance. But of course, the end effect of this is that it'll only undermine their own credibility. And of course, the fact that at least one member of the active consent unit seems to be running a business that can benefit from talking up the issue, I think that's a factor here too.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
As I said there, I contacted members of the active consent unit and sent them written questions. They did not answer. I also contacted the NUIG press office with written questions, again without answer. I contacted Maurice McQuillan of the Life's Too Good Foundation, which is a charity that funds the active consent unit's work. He said that the active consent unit complies with all our funding requirements. I asked what those requirements were. He didn't answer. I also contacted the taxpayer-funded government agency Rethink Ireland, which, as they put it, funds the active consent unit's creation of film content, visual materials and social media to raise awareness and discussions on consent. I pointed out that the social media that they're funding, that we're funding to the tune of nearly €500,000, had been used to publish incorrect information that was not supported by the research, and that the research itself had a question mark over it. Rethink Ireland said, "We are satisfied active consent adheres to our requirements and procedures at this time." I asked them what those requirements and procedures were. They refused to answer. All of the above had weeks to respond if they'd had a mind to. And shortly before the podcast, I contacted RTE to ask whether they thought that their coverage of the report was up to the standard that licence payers should expect, and I contacted the Department of Education for comment. I haven't heard back from either of them yet, but if I do, I'll do an update. Go to the website for sources, images and links to all the things that we've been talking about, including to all the studies and screenshots of the social media. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. And thanks again to all the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote time to research this type of podcast. So if you'd like to hear more of this, please do what they do and donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month. Just go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.